Well, welcome and thank you for joining us tonight. I am Amy Waywell, Director of Membership at the MFA, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture featuring the exhibition Witnessing Humanity, The Art of John Wilson. As always, we appreciate your ongoing support and your participation in our member lecture series. As a reminder, this program is coming to you virtually from the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Founded in 1870, the MFA stands on a site that has long served as a place of meeting and exchange among different Algonquin nations, including the Massachusetts. As a museum, we acknowledge the long histories of the land we occupy today and seek ways to make Indigenous narratives more prominent in our galleries and programming. Now, before I introduce tonight's speaker, I have a few logistical notes to share with you about tonight's program. A transcript and closed captions are available during the lecture. To enable closed captions, simply go to the bottom of the Zoom window and click on the button Show Captions. During the presentation, I encourage you to use Zoom's Q&A function to ask questions and to share comments. And I'll note that tonight's lecture is being recorded, and we anticipate making it available on the MFA's YouTube channel in the coming weeks. And now I'm pleased to introduce tonight's speaker. Edward Saywell is Chair of Prints and Drawings at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. At the MFA, he has also served as Chief of Exhibitions and Gallery Displays, as well as Chair of Contemporary Art, and Arthur K. Solomon Curator of Modern Art, with oversight of the Department of Contemporary Art and the MFA's film, concert, and lecture and course programs. Exhibitions he has recently curated or co-curated at the MFA include, of course, Witnessing Humanity, The Art of John Wilson in 2025, Hyman Bloom, Landscapes of the Mind, Mondrian Foundations, and Ancestors in Place, Indigenous North American Prints, all in 2024, and Marking Resilience, Indigenous North American Prints, Ellsworth Kelly, Plant Lithographs, and the Provincetown Printmakers, all in 2023. Edward, thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing the Art of John Wilson with us.
Thank you so much, Amy, and the warmest of welcomes to everyone. And just to reiterate, Amy's thanks to you all for your enormous support. It's greatly, greatly appreciated. So I'm going to start tonight with Wilson's own words, and they're ones that find kinship in Ralph Ellison's 1952 novel, The Invisible Man. In my youth, the black man was an invisible American, Wilson wrote in a note for a talk at Boston University in 1970. I sense now that I was trying to make black people become really visible in a world that would only see us, when it bothered to look, as undeveloped. Born in 1922 in Roxbury, Wilson's precociousness as an artist was evident in high school, and in 1939 he began his studies at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts. He described, though, how he didn't see himself in the illustrations of art history textbooks, nor on the walls of the MFA, omissions that signaled to Wilson how the history and role of Black Americans had been distorted and, at worst, ignored. In his words, the implication was that Black people were not capable of being beautiful and true and precious, that Black people and their special experience were irrelevant and unimportant. From this early age, though, Wilson fervently believed in the power of art to empower, to change society, to make people see differently, and that the visual arts could force an audience to see and sense the world through the artist's own eyes, that one of his key roles as an artist was to reveal what he described as the true state of affairs, reality. He described how, as a Black artist, he had, quote, a special awareness and a unique position to understand the world, to reveal its truth, to call a spade a spade. His early self-portraits, such as this one made when he was just 21 years old while a student at the SMFA, or this incredible drawing made in 1946, shortly after he had graduated from the SMFA and then after finishing a degree in education at Tufts. His early self-portraits are ones that respond directly to what he saw as the invisibility of Black Americans. And they were also a counter to the images of the Black community in films and magazines of a time that Wilson described as caricature-like, dehumanized, even minstrel-like. And starting with these early works, Wilson's portraits of himself, of his family, and of his friends don't just capture an outward appearance, but they have an extraordinary empathy, humanity, an inner energy. They're authentic. They are positive representations. They have a gravitas and dignity. They're resolute. They demand attention. They exude a determination, and they have an incredible sense of personal agency. This all becomes a thread through Wilson's career, all the way through to the much beloved sculpture, Eternal Presence, known by so many in Boston and the neighborhood of Roxbury, where it sits, as the Big Head, a sculpture from 1987, 40 years after he made those early self-portraits. Eternal Presence is an image that Wilson described as one that you cannot ignore, a work that cannot be camouflaged. It is, in many respects, the ultimate distillation of all that Wilson had been working on in his art since those earliest days and self-portraits. And it's actually why we wanted the exhibition to literally pivot around the model of a head. And here you see an installation image of the exhibition. We're standing right in front of the entrance wall, but you can see to the left how you see through to the last gallery and the incredible model for Eternal Presence, which is in the MFA's collection. And so, in works that reveal an extraordinary maturity from his earliest years, Wilson sought to create what he called powerful and provocative works to communicate what he knew, what he experienced, what he was moved by, and what he knew was absent. And throughout his life, it meant his art was very fundamentally related to his life experience, to force people to get involved with, to identify with his subject matter, to re-experience what he called the kinds of realities he felt when creating the work. And the subject of his choosing was the human figure, friends, family, the ordinary person on the street, and himself. And as his wife Julie, represented here in an early portrait of 1956 with their first daughter, Becky, Julie, who is still with us at the age of 98, as she encapsulated at Wilson's passing in 2015, and I quote, essentially, he felt that his main objective as an artist was to deliver a message to people about Black dignity, about racial justice, about poor people trying to get a better deal in life. Above all, he wanted a viewer to see what he described as the common humanity and beauty in all people, and through the experience of his heart, hopefully to feel, to think, and act differently towards each other. His work, though, does not shy away from the anger and indignation he felt at the rights and freedoms not accorded to the Black community. In Black Soldier, for example, a work that he made again as a student at the SMFA, a family is seen before a tenement building that Wilson claimed represented Roxbury. A mother wraps her arms protectively around a young child who turns his head to look at her, and by contrast, her gaze transcends the canvas, a technique Wilson used frequently to allow his subjects, and by association himself, to address the viewer. Behind them, a man in military uniform stands facing in the opposite direction, in a way signaling his imminent departure. He wears a pith helmet. He holds his weapon aloft. his pose mirroring that of the Statue of Liberty, which is visible in the distance. She holds up her torch, a symbol of enlightenment and hope, to quote, "You're tired, you're poor, you're huddled masses yearning to breathe free." And adjacent to the painting, you see a preparatory drawing that Wilson made for the painting, in which the composition is actually switched around. The soldier is in the foreground, the mother and child are in the background. Now, the symbol of the Statue of Liberty would only have been magnified at this particular time, a moment when it appeared repeatedly in US government propaganda, posters, for example, appealing to the nation's sense of nationalism and patriotism during World War II. It was promoted as an American icon, a beacon of freedom and democracy. And yet the soldier's position between the sculpture and his family illustrates the profound gap between dreams of liberty and freedom for which he will fight overseas for, yet does not possess stateside. Wilson was indignant at this injustice, and even though he did not serve in the military due to health issues, his brothers Frederick and William did. And even within the army, black soldiers suffered the indignities of segregation, were not granted equality, and when they returned from combat, black veterans continued to face racial discrimination and violence. In Wilson's words, "I resented the idea of blacks going off to fight for other people's freedoms while ours were being neglected here at home." For Wilson and others in the black community, liberty enlightening the world, to give the statue its full name, was as much a symbol of promises unfulfilled as of hope and of an encouragement. The terror, though, of the war at home with the rampant injustices of profound institutional, systemic, and individual racism are embodied in this haunting painting, Black Despair. Depicting his brother Billy while on leave from secondment to an army base in the Jim Crow South, the work captures the physical and the psychological trauma and cost of military service when it intersected with and was compounded by the traumas of racism. Wilson recounts how the work captures the moment shortly after Billy found out that he needed to return to the army base, one that he dare not leave for fear of discrimination and violence against him. The painting does not depict the trauma of being sent to the actual front of the war in Europe, but the literal despair of knowing there was no escape from a posting back to the Jim Crow South. Wilson draws further parallels between the genocide overseas and racial violence in the United States with one of the most powerful works in the show, Deliver Us from Evil, which connects the moral atrocities of lynching and genocide. It's unflinchingly direct. The image is haunting and brutally explicit. A quote that Wilson gave to the Boston Globe more than 50 years after he made this print is especially resonant. "I am a black artist. I'm a black person," Wilson told the Globe. "To me, my experience as a black person had given me a special way of looking at the world and a special identity with others who experience some injustices. I grew up in a world that said I could be killed if I stepped out of line. There is a core of anger and frustration I have to vent." The print depicts what Wilson considered one of the greatest moral atrocities of American history, the lynchings of thousands of Black Americans. Extrajudicial, many were murdered, not because they committed a crime or social infraction, or even accused as such, but simply because they were Black and present. Lynching sought to keep the Black community terrorized and in constant state of fear, a vicious tool of power and control, bold public acts that implicated entire communities. In this two-part composition, Wilson presents the oppression of Blacks in the United States as a kind of mirror image of the Nazi oppression of Jews and others in Europe. based in historical fact, given the Nazis were looking to American laws such as the anti-miscegenation laws or those removing rights and lands of indigenous peoples to build their own heinous Nazi platform. On the left, a Hitler-like figure stands defiant at the top. A mother and child, Madonna-like in depiction, are in the middle ground, in front of a father-like figure. Broken bodies of a genocide fill the foreground. And on the right, the image of white spectators to a lynching, a mother's arm outstretched, daughter at her side, shake us to our core. And standing amidst the horrors, defiant, bold, an encapsulation of the Black dignity that Julie Wilson spoke as being core to John Wilson's identity, is clearly Wilson himself. Like many Black Americans at the time, angry and exhausted that there was no reciprocal fight for their freedom, their rights, or protection being made by the American government on the home front. The first work of Wilson's acquired by the MFA in 1946 is this print Streetcar, and it encapsulates many of the key issues and ideas that Wilson tackles in his earliest work. The sole Black figure looking out at us can be identified as a dock worker from the badge that he wears on his jacket that states Navy Yards. It has an overwhelming sense of isolation and alienation, and it depicts what Wilson described as, and I quote, the reality of being Black in this impossible world. It's one of a number of works in which Wilson focused on the connections between economic injustice and racial discrimination. It took World War II and President Roosevelt's Executive Order 8802 in 1941 to desegregate the defense industries in the United States, a measure that only highlighted the historical economic exploitation of Black Americans. Although the war had expanded job opportunities, Black Americans were aware that the factories or the docks that employed them were only desegregated due to increased production demands and the labor shortage created by the draft. As Wilson noted, I resented the fact that almost everyone on my block was on welfare until they needed us in the shipyards and factories. Stoic in appearance, he's a manifestation of Wilson's observation that when Black people found themselves in such overwhelmingly white contexts, they had to be, and I quote, armed with their sense of personal dignity. And Wilson later referred to this print as a reflection of his own anxiety about finding work as a Black artist. That anxiety led to a crisis of confidence while a student at the SMFA, and at one point he nearly dropped out, and it was only through the advocacy of his teachers, especially Carl Zerby, that he persevered and indeed flourished. And in 1946, shortly after he graduated from the SMFA in 1944, the School of the Museum of Fine Arts awarded Wilson a James William Page Traveling Fellowship for a 2-year period of study in Europe. And while in Paris, he studied with Fernand Léger, and his work at this moment reveals how Léger actually freed him from what Wilson described as the photographic quality of his early works, those works which have an extraordinary precociousness in respect to their drawing ability, in order, in this instance, to start to focus on color, on shape, on line, and on abstraction. Upon his return from Paris to the US in 1950, he was awarded a fellowship to travel to Mexico. And just months after marrying Julie Kovich, the newlywed couple moved to Mexico City. A sign of the times, though, was that as a biracial couple, they had to travel in separate cars due to the anti-miscegenation laws of the southern states, making it unsafe for them to travel in the same car. They reunited only after they had crossed the border into Mexico. Since his student days, Wilson had been drawn to the art of the Mexican social realists, artists such as Jose Clemente Orozco, David Alfaro Siqueiros, and Diego Rivera. He was excited by how their work, in his words, and I quote, dealt with socialist ideas and images of people who were left out or unimportant. And Wilson described how, as a Black person, I identified with it. I wanted to do my African American version. He went on, the aim of the Mexican muralist movement was to be spokespeople for the common man. They wanted to create works of art expressing the reality of the forgotten ones, revealing their history, their celebrations and struggles. Mural painting is a public thing because it's available to masses of people. And so, through Mexican art, I began to experience a sense of how to depict my reality. And I think it's beautifully encapsulated in this powerful painting. Although Wilson made just one mural in Mexico, The Incident, his time there was enormously impactful, including his taking of courses on mural making and working at the Tala de Grafica Popular, the workshop of popular graphic art known as the TGP, which was a collective print shop that focused on inexpensive, mass-produced prints that were socially engaged and oftentimes politically progressive. While Wilson found his time abroad a respite from the systemic racism he experienced in the United States, it was also challenging, in his words, to express long distance the experience of an African American in the States. A print that he made while in Mexico, The Trial, speaks to that challenge of separation, for it really did prove impossible to escape the news of the racially motivated violence in the North. It prompted what Wilson actually described as a monumental rage and a bitter frustration at how such injustices flew in the face of what he described as freedom-loving America. The Trial is a searing commentary on the persistent racial inequality and bias embedded within so many political and legal systems. A Black man stands before a trio of menacing white judges who peer down at him from upon high, an exaggeratedly high and imposing bench. Wilson described the print as a response to the infamous Scottsboro Boys trial of 1931, a major turning point for the civil rights movement in which 9 young Black men were falsely accused of raping a white woman and other miscarriages of justice. Initially, he sought to make the work as a mural and ultimately settled on making it as a print. If you look really carefully at your screen, you will see how the judges are actually masked. You will see how their faces almost flay off from their heads. Wilson described how the print was to show the false racist ideology of white supremacy, and he noted that the judges wearing masks were intended to suggest that they were indulging not just in what he called deceptive fantasies, but they were also hiding what he described as their true humanity. In 1952, in Mexico City, Wilson depicted here at the left side of the mural, painted The Incident, an explicit and horrifying depiction of American racial violence and terror. Arguably, it is the most explicit depiction of racialized violence in American art up to that point. Made at street level on an exterior wall of one of the schools of art in Mexico City, the twice life-size work was painted for a course Wilson was taking on mural painting. The fresco was meant to be temporary, but its impact was such that the renowned Mexican muralist David Alfaro Siqueiros, then head of Mexico's Department of the Protection and Restoration of Murals, advocated for its preservation. Unfortunately, the work no longer survives, but a large number of preparatory studies and subsequent works inspired by it do, a testament to the significance that it held for Wilson. Wilson's first encounter with the physical and psychological brutality of lynching was as a child. He recounted how, I quote, practically every month there would be some charred, hanging body featured in the progressive black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier or the Amsterdam News that his father would subscribe to and read. Wilson described how, and I quote, emotionally he saw himself as one of those victims. He described making this mural as a means to exorcise the oppression and the trauma that he had carried with him since his childhood. I quote, the minute you stepped out of the black neighborhood, you knew exactly that you were in a foreign country. You simply didn't belong. I very consciously felt as a young kid this business of the terror that was used to keep black people in their place. I wasn't born in the South, but the South was a microcosm. It was an intense reality of what happened. There was actual physical lynching and murder in the South. There was psychological lynching in the North. In the exhibition, we have a color study for the mural. Few artists have drawn attention more powerfully to what Wilson called the moral atrocity of lynching. The work itself is unflinching. The victimized black body and dehumanizing murder at the hands of a hooded Klansman at right, only magnified by the chilling sight of a terrified mother and child within the claustrophobic interior space of the house. What sets it apart from prior depictions of such extrajudicial killings is that juxtaposition of the brutal scene of the lynched body against that of a black home, a scene that is one that should be filled with a sense of love, comfort, protection, nurture, safety. Instead, it is one of fear and of foreboding of the external violence. And of course, historically, images of a mother and a child, a Madonna and child, are those that preclude fear and foreboding. Yet here, the mother's fearfulness is palpable as she tightly clutches her child. The inner or the outward expression of her inner emotions betrays her deep anxiety, her brow furrowed, her darting eyes cast over her shoulder to a threat. After 6 years in Mexico in 1956, Wilson and his family returned to the United States, partly because he felt no longer able to comment on the racial inequalities and inequities of the North while living at a remove in Mexico. Over his lifetime, Wilson was less a committed political activist, as more being interested in what he described as a politics of change. In his words, an artist is ipso facto critical of society, constantly dissecting. I want my people to, I want my art to reach people. I want people to get the message that my art has. I want their social attitudes to change as a result of the things I do. Among his most powerful works that do speak closely to the political tumult of a civil rights movement are this drawing and print titled enigmatically Oracle, a person through whom a god or deity is believed to speak. In the drawing at left, a black man is depicted standing on an elevated platform in the center of the crowd, clenched fists raised to the sky. Wilson described the inspiration for the image as the National Memorial African Bookstore, a landmark in Harlem, run by the civil rights activist Louis Michaud. For decades, it was the center of Black literary life and the civil rights movement in New York. Wilson spoke of how this figure of Oracle in his drawing and in the print embodied the collective spirit of Harlem's Black nationalists, as well as being an embodiment of leading Black writers such as James Baldwin, Langston Hughes, and Richard Wright. But it's also hard to escape the moment the drawing was made in, 1965, a year which saw the assassination of Malcolm X, the Voting Rights March from Selma to Montgomery, the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the centennial of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the arrival of U.S. armed troops in Vietnam, and the first major civil rights march in Boston, led by Martin Luther King Jr. from Roxbury to Boston Common. Political too, but in a far quieter and more tender way, is Study for Child with Father from 1968. The image of a father's embrace, arms forming a protective wall around his child, takes on added poignancy against the turbulent backdrop of late 60s Americas. This tender image is not bleak nor confrontational, but it's actually full of hope and empathy. The small child at center, enfolded and protected by the arms of an invisible father, evokes the potential of the next generation while addressing what it means to bring a Black child into a world fraught with bigotry and blatant injustice. It speaks as powerfully to the moment as more overt images of protest. The drawing is in fact a study for a related lithograph that was Wilson's contribution to a portfolio called Artists Against Racism and the War. It was a group that was organized in Boston in the spring of 1968 to resist the Vietnam War and, quote, challenge indifference to the critical issues in the Black community. Dedicated to the memory and ideals of Martin Luther King Jr., printed just weeks after his assassination, the portfolio accompanied a series of political actions that took place throughout Boston in May 1968. One of the great surprises to me when we embarked on the exhibition project was Wilson's commitment to the illustration of children's books. And I want to take a moment here to read the words of Equa Holmes, the noted children's book illustrator, a native of Roxbury, and who in her early years was influenced by the work of John Wilson. And her words are on the wall in the book nook. And I quote Equa. Wilson was intentional in all his work to reflect his community, and the books he chose to illustrate are no different. These stories allow us to imagine a richer, safer, and more loving world, a hopeful world. Our children lead complex lives. They are living and experiencing all that we see and read in the news, and they need to know that they are not alone in whatever struggles they face. Wilson understood this, and such knowledge is why his art to this day has such a brilliant ripple effect, like a stone thrown into a pond, expanding the mindsets of children and their parents alike. I just think Equa's analogy in this instance is so beautiful. On view in the book nook of the exhibition are drawings related to 3 of Wilson's books, including a very powerful biography of Malcolm X that was written for children aged 7 to 10 years old in elementary school. It's a book that does not shy away from any part of Malcolm X's biography, including the violence of the Ku Klux Klan against his family. Or hear the beautiful and moving and deeply empathic story of Becky. The drawings are incredibly touching and beautiful. The text, written by Wilson's wife, Julie, tells the story of Becky and her mum visiting a toy store on Becky's birthday. And in the drawing at left, you see Becky falling in love with a doll, a little brown doll that looks just like her, but it's too expensive. And as mum and daughter leave the store empty-handed, the doll magically comes alive and bounces off the counter, follows them home in the snow, and here's a wonderful image at the end of the book of Becky blowing out her birthday candles. The importance of teaching Reading and learning were lifelong passions for Wilson, including at Boston University, where he taught from 1964 to 1986. And a key part of our project was to think about how we could reflect this commitment and reconnect Wilson's work to current students. So last fall, we worked with many students at BU, including the 70 or so students that are currently enrolled in the drawing class that Wilson himself taught more than 50 years ago. Those students visited us here at the MFA, studied Wilson's drawings, and their class project was to respond to one of Wilson's works, and their works were on view at a gallery on BU's campus when our show opened. Equally, we also worked with the MFA class in visual narratives at BU. And what I'm showing here is the result of that, an incredible zine in which the students responded to various works in the exhibition, bringing their own lived experiences into their own incredible illustrated narratives. And this is something which you can actually download from the exhibition webpage on mfa.org or from within the exhibition itself. And Wilson actually described how reading with his father was one of the most intimate and important activities that he shared with him. I quote, "This sense of nurturing was part of me. When I became a father, I felt very strongly about this relationship." And this bond is reflected in a series of works on paper and in sculpture in which Wilson explored the subject of a father and child reading together, culminating in a large-scale bronze sculpture of the subject that was unveiled in 1990 on the campus of Roxbury Community College. It marks not just his own experience as a father with his children, but it was, in Wilson's words, in essence, a homage to my parents who passed on their love of reading to me. In the late 1960s, Wilson began to focus, as he had done as a student, on portraiture, creating works, especially drawings, that captured the underlying spirit and essential humanity of those around him. According to the artist, the images were not intended to be lifelike portraits as much as what he described as interpretations, symbolic interpretations. And Wilson's keen powers of observations are so evident in the portraits of his loved ones. As he said, it was never neutral. His renewed focus on portraiture here, executed with brilliant skill as he captures his eldest daughter, are a powerful counterpoint to the historical absence or degradation of the Black figurative image in both everyday life and the visual arts that Wilson had challenged from his earliest student days. Among his most ambitious works are the life-size studies that he made between 1972 and 1975, called The Un-Americans. They were made for an unrealized mural. The series depicts a multiracial group of teenagers whom Wilson viewed as representing a new generation and, by association, a new future, governed by equality and free of racial prejudice. And while the images reflect a sense of optimism, these portraits are also tempered by both his plans for the mural falling through and by contemporaneous external events such as the racially charged Boston busing crisis. With an increasing belief that two-dimensional, illusionistic images were, in his words, inadequate, Wilson started to shift to sculpture at this time too, and he soon saw parallels between making sculptures and his drawings, once describing his drawings actually as akin to carving forms out of space. But he was also attracted to the broader accessibility of public sculpture in particular. His most famous work in sculpture is Eternal Presence, the Big Head, commissioned in 1983 and unveiled in 1987. He begins, though, to think about a monumental head, and here I show the maquette, the model, which is in the exhibition, to back in the 1970s. And as he said earlier on in this talk, it was a sculpture that he wanted to meet the challenge of an image that you couldn't ignore. It was commissioned by Barry Gator, the then director of the National Center of Afro-American Artists, and it truly rises from the earth. Based on studies made in the very early 1970s, including this one of a family friend called Roz, who he described as like a living sculpture. And here we see Roz herself. This is a very early study as he began to imagine this monumental head again in the early 1970s. And here's the sculpture itself on one of the most special days of the year. Usually the first Saturday after July the 4th, the community is invited to wash the head and then wax it. The sculpture feeds not only from his early work, but also from the Olmec heads that he saw in Mexico, the Buddhist heads that he saw here at the MFA. It's an image that he described as neither male nor female, albeit a black image. He intended it to be a universal image, one that could stand for all humankind. It was my answer, Wilson once said, to all the omissions, the things that I did not see in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. I wanted to make a black image that you could not ignore. And the other great sculpture that Wilson made was in response to a 1984 nationwide competition to create a bust of Martin Luther King for the US Capitol. Coretta Scott King describing how the sculpture should show Martin Luther King Jr. as the pastor, the clergyman, serious-minded, concerned, compassionate, and with humility. And Wilson described how he wanted to, in his words, convey the sense of his ideas and the spiritual energy that made him a universal symbol for peace and freedom. It was the first congressional commission to honor an African American and the first commission awarded to a black artist. I wanted people to recognize him, Wilson said, but also I wanted to suggest the intangible energy and strength, the sense of dogged strength he had that allowed him to carry out those impossible campaigns. He was able to use his verbal skills to convince masses of ordinary people to do those extraordinary things. All of that is what I'm trying to put into this head. Cited today among the founding fathers and past presidents, this contemplative portrayal, I think, redefines the meaning of monumentality. And the MFA is also fortunate enough to have this incredibly powerful study that Wilson made for the sculpture. And Wilson spoke of how portraits such as this tend to fill a picture plane because, I quote, I want them to be images that can't be dismissed. I want them to confront people. And despite the relative small scale of this drawing, Wilson conveys an incredible sense of monumentality, a sense with his brooding eyes of a window into the soul of Martin Luther King Jr. And so to wrap up, and we circle back in a way to where we started with a very early self-portrait from 1944. If Wilson's earliest works declared his ambition to fight injustices, to make visible Black faces, figures, and experiences, his very last works are no less strident in underscoring the work still to be done to achieve representation, respect, and equality for all people. In his very late self-portrait, it is one of the very latest works in the exhibition. He literally cuts and scours into the paper to capture his visibly craggy and weathered face, a reflection of his lifetime of experiences. And that bold stare and penetrating gaze is as demanding as ever. In the exhibition, we actually have these works together, in fact, one on top of another. For us in this moment, it's a reminder that as a student, Wilson did not see himself at an institution such as this. While many museums, such as the MFA, have sought to correct such omissions in recent years, much of what Wilson called out and recounted remains as valid today as it was in 1944 when he made the early self-portrait on the left, or in 2002 when he made his portrait on the right. It's a true testament to why we cannot look away from Wilson's art, not just because of its strength of humanity, empathy, and message of social justice and Black dignity, but how his figurative work continues so powerfully and critically to resonate amid today's national dialogues about race, equality, and representation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Edward, for the really fascinating look at Wilson's artwork and at this exhibition that you put together so beautifully. So much of what you talked about resonates as much today as it did 60, 70 years ago. So thank you again. We do have some time for questions, so I'm going to remind our members at home that you can use the Q&A function at Zoom to ask questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. And we actually have a couple in the in the Q&A already for you, Edward. So we'll start with a question about if you could elaborate at all on John Wilson's relationships with other Black artists in Boston at that time, and if he ever shared any thoughts about their works in the 40s, 50s, 60s, as he was also producing art here in the city.
That's such a great question. Um, a really formative experience for him as a student. I mean, both as a teenager. So he took um, evening classes at the Roxbury Boys Club. I mean, his mum and dad really understood what an extraordinary talent he was. So even as a teenager, and then when he was at the SMFA, a really critical formative figure was Alan Rowan Cright. And what's really exciting is Cright, who is so often called the sort of father figure, the grandfather figure of African American art in Boston. What's really exciting is that there are actually going to be two exhibitions in Boston later this year focused on Cright, one at the Boston Athenaeum and one at the Gardner. So 2025 has been this fantastic year in which we're celebrating John Wilson's work and then Cright. And Cright was almost like a father figure to him as an artist. Cright really encouraged Wilson on many levels, including if you remember the portrait of the Black soldier and his family. So the family in front of a Statue of Liberty. That was a painting which I mentioned Wilson made as a student, and Cright encouraged Wilson to submit that painting to what were called the Atlanta Annuals. These were prizes awarded by the University of Atlanta beginning in 1940 to African American artists. And it was both a cash prize, but also the university purchased the work of art as well.
Mm.
Wilson won a prize for that painting at the behest of Cright. And I think you can also, if you imagine Alan Rowan Cright's imagery, which is so based in his community, in his neighborhood, the South End of Roxbury, so centered on the people around him, that was again something that I think Wilson took from Cright as being so central and a thread across a six-decade career. Wilson also as I mentioned, was not necessarily deeply politically activist, but he was very politically aware and socially aware, certainly in the 60s and early 70s. And he again formed a very tight community with Black artists at that particular moment in time. He was, for example, critical in the early years of the National Center of Afro-American Artists in Roxbury. He was actually on the search committee for Barry Gator, the very first director. So he was very present, and I think also as a teacher at BU, particularly for Black students, he was again a very formative and significant figure.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Um, Another question has come in. You mentioned the time that Wilson spent in Paris, I believe it was, that he
Yeah.
began experimenting with abstraction. This member is curious if that was only a brief time in his career, since so much of the rest of his work is very representational and realistic, or was it something that he continued to experiment with later?
It's such a terrific question. So complete abstraction was truly a blip. It was a momentary sort of matter of months within his career in which he made a very, very small number of completely abstract paintings.
Mm,
Um, I'm not sure anyone would necessarily call them the most successful of works either, um, but his years in Paris were very important and very formative because um, what Ferdinand Léger taught him, and in fact he basically knocked on the door of Léger's studio because Wilson was actually very excited to learn mural making from Leger. And what Leger instead taught him, as I mentioned, was how to think about color and abstraction and form. And giving him that opportunity was really like a scaffold. And that scaffold was something that he took with him, especially to Mexico, where you also see the influence of the Mexican social realists beginning to manifest themselves in his work. But that scaffold that he learned in Paris um, was with him throughout his career, even through to the very, very last works. And in fact, in the exhibition, we have a small wall label which juxtaposes one of Ferdinand Léger's paintings against actually the very, very last work that is in the show that Wilson made from, I think, 2003, 2004, which is a print. And you really still see how important the sense of abstraction and breaking down a form was to him, even at that point. What he never lost, though, was that extraordinary ability and precociousness to draw. I mean, on an absolute genius level. Um,
mm,
and I think that is something else that you really see in the exhibition, particularly because of the way we have these sort of windows from one gallery to the next. Um, and you see how the drawings that he was making as an 18, 19, 20-year-old, they stand up to the works that he was making 4 or 5 decades later. And it's actually extraordinarily rare to think of an artist where you could juxtapose the works that they were making as a college student with the works that an artist was then making in their most mature years, and for those works to still have resonance, for those works to still speak to each other, for those works to still hold up against each other. And I think that he never escaped from that amazing ability to create figurative work. But those years in Paris were important. But there are only a handful, 3 or 4,
mm.
truly fully abstract works.
Interesting. It also seemed, and I guess this is the question, is that also where Wilson began to introduce more color into some of it? It seemed like the first, certainly in the presentation and in some of the works in the exhibition, it's the first time that we really see,
Yeah.
um, you know, colorful clothing. Or is there a connection there
Yeah.
between
So
sort of moving
yeah, it's
internationally?
yeah, it's a great observation, Amy. So actually, I had a colleague as we were installing the exhibition walk through and look at some of his prints, which are basically mostly all in black and white. And the colleague said, "Wow, it's as if he's drawing and making his art with 50 shades of black and gray." And
Right.
that is something which you really get an incredible sense of throughout the show. His astonishing ability to create strong three-dimensional form from just almost like a chiaroscuro sense of light and shadow, of black and grays. But he was also a brilliant colorist, and you see that especially in the works, 2 paintings, in fact, in the gallery that is dedicated to his works in Mexico. But he essentially all but stops painting after he returns to the United States in 1956. So his paintings are really front-ended when in his student years and in his Mexico years, and that's where you see these very rich jewel-like colors, in fact. Um, the one big shift that you also see color is with some of his illustration work, so the works for his children's books, and also with the Young Americans, those large-scale
Right.
drawings, which are incredibly vibrantly colored. Um, there are a handful of colors which he will return to. There's that incredible yellow, which we actually pick up on in the space for the book nook. That yellow is something that it recurs in a number of his prints and his drawing. He uses his beautiful terracotta red on
Mhm.
occasion as well. There's also a blue that he returns to, and then again in a very late series of prints that focus on a short story by Richard Wright. The thread throughout those prints is a very symbolic use of the color blue. So he's very, very judicious in his use of color. He's very particular. He is a brilliant colorist, but it is largely his exceptional ability to quite literally sculpt three-dimensional form out of just black and gray that I think resonates through the whole show.
Absolutely. Completely agree. Um, there's another question while we're talking about his sort of international life or his life living internationally. Did he ever consider really permanently moving away from the United States, or is that any insight that we have from his family? Or
Yeah,
was it really
no,
committed to working here?
yeah,
And
no, it's again a good question. And we actually have it, we have the answer to that in his own words,
mm,
in that he was obviously in Europe, traveled around Europe in the late 1940s, got the fellowship to Mexico in 1950 and was there for 6 years. But he actually decided to return to the United States for a couple of reasons. One, their youngest child, Becky, had just been born, but also I think very important was his description of how increasingly challenging it was for him to speak to comment upon, to depict the issues of discrimination and
mhm,
inequalities and inequities that were north of the border when he was south of the border and at such a distance. And so, even though some of the works that he's making in Mexico, such as The Trial, are picking up on historical inequities and inequalities, he's realizing that it is increasingly difficult to continue to be part of that dialogue from such a distance. And it's at that point that he decides he needs to return to the United States with his family. And he does
mm.
so initially to Chicago just for a tiny bit of time, then down to New York, where he actually teaches in high school. And then in 64, he returns to Boston, where he lives in Brookline for the rest of his life.
That's terrific. Thank you so much. I think we have maybe time for one more question.
Sure.
Um, and let me see. We'll change topic a little bit and ask, could you speak a little bit about how Wilson's work was received by artists outside of the sort of the kind of Black artist community, either here in Boston or New York or Paris, and how maybe there was influence um, of Wilson's work on others
Yeah,
outside of this Boston community?
yeah, all such great questions. So I answer that in a number of ways. One is we know when talking to Wilson's students the incredible influence he had as a teacher.
Mm,
He was incredibly empathic. He was deeply engaged, and pretty much any student of his that you talk to, um, there is a resonance that continues within their work. There is a resonance in terms of what he taught them in respect to how to draw, how to model, how to think about a figure. And in fact, the much beloved Boston artist Robert Freeman, um, was a student of John's, and Bob has um, a wonderful text in the exhibition that speaks to the incredible importance that John holds for him. So I would say that yes, there is deep importance for that younger generation of artists. We know he also had success in Paris, where his work was shown. Um, he was clearly in a circle of artists in Mexico City, including, for example, with the great artist Elizabeth Catlett, who actually became the godmother of Becky. Um, but one of the reasons that we really wanted to do this show is that Wilson is not as well known as he should be.
Mm,
And part of that reason is that his body of work is actually very small. Um, he made probably only about 90 paintings, about 60, 65 or so prints over the course of his life. Um, Only about 11 sculptures, and it's his drawings where he was most prolific. But drawings are by their very nature light sensitive and fugitive, so
mm,
oftentimes they are not works that we can put up on the walls in our museums for very, very long. Um, and so he never got into the art history books in a way that he should have done. And of course, as a Black artist, he wasn't accorded the attention that so many Black artists were not accorded for many, many years. But Equa Holmes, who I mentioned and
mhm.
quoted, extraordinary children's illustrator. We had an exhibition of her work here a number of years ago. Just brilliant on so many levels. She also speaks so powerfully at the influence that John Wilson had on her becoming an artist and the reason why she chose the career path she did. So I think there is a very deep influence for those who really connected with John on a personal level, and we sincerely hope that this exhibition is going to put him onto a different type of platform, a national platform, an international platform. And just as the Boston University students who we engaged with last fall went on in their own work to show the continued resonance and relevance and prescience of his work, so we hope that the exhibition here in Boston, and when it moves down to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York this September, where it will be on view through the start of February, we sincerely hope that it will be able to propel Wilson's work to a new level of attention.
I absolutely think it will, and it's a great point that you can have an impact in your own time, and art, of course, lives on forever, and there's always
Yeah,
that opportunity to continue to have an impact long decades later. So Edward, thank you so much. So many of the comments actually in the chat are not questions. They are simply compliments, both to you for the fascinating talk. A lot of folks who are planning their next visit to see the exhibition, and for sharing really your depth of knowledge about John Wilson. So you've done a wonderful job
thank
in
you.
giving him an excellent platform tonight. So thank you so much.
Pleasure.
And for members joining us from home, I do encourage, if you have not seen these works in person, please plan your next visit to the MFA and make sure that you have an opportunity to see this while it is on view here at the MFA through June 22nd. And a reminder that this is part of your general admission benefits. So you need nothing more than your member card to come to the museum and to take in these works in person. So Edward, thank you again.
My pleasure.
And to
Thank
everyone at home, I wish you a pleasant evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Good night.
Good night.